Well, guys, we've made it to the end of Unit 2 pretty much with Dorothy and the Scarecrow, this being our last lesson focused specifically on it. So what we're going to do today is we're going to work on comparing and contrasting the treatment of similar events and stories and seeing about how that affects our characters. So let's begin with our first part of just thinking about Peter Pan. Because if you remember, Peter Pan is what we read last week, and there's some similarities and differences between our characters. So we're going to analyze a section of Come Away, and this week we're going to analyze a section of How Dorothy Saved the Scarecrow. We're going to compare and contrast the actions of the characters in these two readings. So this is going to be our focus prompt that we're going to specifically look at. In paragraphs 27 to 38, so that's important, so I am going to highlight those so I know which paragraphs I'm going to look at. Of Come Away, in paragraphs 9 through 13 of How Dorothy Saved the Scarecrow, characters help other characters. How are the characters' actions in the two texts similar, and how are they different? And then it tells me specifically, it wants me to write stars next to the paragraphs that show characters' actions in each story. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to Come Away, and I'm going to read paragraphs 27 to 38. So here's our story of Peter Pan, and I'm going to paragraphs 27, and I'm going to read to 38. And I'm going to put a star next to the paragraphs that show me their actions. So I'm going to focus on events and traits related to the prompt of how and why characters end up helping each other. So let's begin by starting on paragraph 27. I wasn't crying about mothers, he said rather indignantly. I was crying because I can't get my shadow to stick on. Besides, I wasn't crying. It has come off? Yes. Then Wendy saw the shadow on the floor looking so draggled, and was frightfully sorry for Peter. How awful, she said, but she could not help smiling when she saw that he'd been trying to stick it on with soap. How exactly like a boy. Fortunately, she knew at once what to do. It must be sewn on, she said, just a little patronizing. So we have this part right here. She's going to help him sew his shadow on. What's sewn? He asked. You're dreadfully ignorant. No, I'm not. But she was exulting in his ignorance. I shall sew it on for you, my little man. So here she goes helping again, she said, though he was as tall as herself. And she got out her sewing bag and sewed the shadow onto Peter's foot. I dare say it will hurt a little, she warned. Oh, I shan't cry, said Peter, who was already of the opinion that he had never cried in his life. And he clenched his teeth and did not cry. And soon his shadow was behaving properly, though still a little creased. So we have those two stars that we put in. It was about how Wendy did what? She sewed that shadow on to help. So now we're going to read those paragraphs 9 to 13 about Dorothy and the Scarecrow and see how she helps him. So 9 to 13 on this section. I'm not feeling well, said the Scarecrow with a smile, for it is very tedious being perched up here night and day to scare away crows. Can't you get down? Asked Dorothy. No, for this pole is stuck up my back. If you will please take away the pole, I shall be greatly obliged to you. Dorothy reached up both hands and lifted the figure off the pole. For it being stuffed with straw, it was quite light. So here Dorothy is helping our Scarecrow. Thank you very much, said the Scarecrow, when he had been set down on the ground. I feel like a new man. So Dorothy in this one, she helped the Scarecrow do what? She helped him by getting him off the pole. And now we remember from the rest of it that she's going to have another companion on her journey. So now, let's begin with this part right here. We're looking at how are the characters' actions in the two texts similar, and how are they different. So we have actually kind of 3 characters / 4 characters. We have Dorothy and the Scarecrow, and we have Peter and Wendy. So let's look at how our events were similar. So my first one is that both Peter and the Scarecrow, they're kind of unusual. They're not regular characters. And how is that so? Well, Peter is a boy without a shadow, and the Scarecrow can talk. So I'm going to put those in for my similarities. So let me stretch this out. They're both those unusual characters. There we go. Now let's make it a little bigger so we can see it better. they're both unusual. Remember, Peter is a boy without a shadow, and everyone has a shadow. And the Scarecrow is a scarecrow who can talk. So both a little bit different, both how they're similar. Now, what's another way how they're similar? Well, it's kind of the purpose of this prompt. They're both similar because they receive help. And it's not just they receive help, but they receive help from what? From the people that they just met. So imagine that. You just met a stranger, especially someone who kind of broke into your room, and you're going to offer to help them. So that's how they're similar. Now, we have this other column over here about how are they different. So we're not just going to focus now on just Peter and the Scarecrow, but we have those two other characters. So let's see if we can figure out maybe incorporating them as well. Incorporating Wendy and Dorothy. So in the event, how are they different? Let me get there we go. And let's drag it across. There we go. So how are the characters and events different? Well, the Scarecrow asks Dorothy for help, but what does Peter do? He actually doesn't ask for help. Wendy volunteers to help Peter without him asking. So that right there is going to be one of our big differences. The Scarecrow's actively seeking someone to assist him, while Peter's just trying to say, I'm a boy, I can do it myself. Now, can you think of another difference that happened in our story? Well, if you remember, they both have reactions. How's the Scarecrow's reaction? He's very grateful. And when we compare that to Peter, if you remember, Peter is not very grateful. He said it kind of ends with thinking that he did it all by himself. And Wendy has to remind him that, no, Wendy was the one that did. She was the one who did. They even use that word sarcasm in one of our paragraphs. So we're going to add that part in here about the Scarecrow is grateful, while Peter at first takes credit for what Wendy had done. So we have these different things going on. We can see how some of the traits are similar. They're both unusual. They both receive help. And we can also see how they're different in our story. They're different because one asks for help and the other one gets help without his asking. And they're also different how they react. The Scarecrow reacts gratefully, while Peter's kind of a jerk. Remember, Peter takes credit. So as we're doing our reading and writing, we can go on further and think, how can we incorporate this in our fairy tale when we do our final draft next week?